Welcome back to the deep dive. Sometimes a single news story just, opens up like a whole can of worms, raising questions about some pretty fundamental rights and, the balance of power thing.
Right.
That's exactly what we're dealing with today.
Absolutely.
You sent us this clip from Candace Owens,
Yeah.
and she's raising some serious flags about the detainment of Mahmoud Khalil.
Hmm.
Now, this guy's a Palestinian green card holder and a former Columbia University student.
Interesting.
And this isn't just like a random arrest.
Right.
We're talking accusations of terrorism, whispers about due process violations,
Hmm.
and even a connection to a British diplomatic mission.
It's a fascinating case, I think,
Yeah.
and it really forces us to think about, where we draw the line between national security and individual freedoms,
Yeah.
especially when it comes to immigrants who may not have the same protections as full citizens.
Okay, so for those who aren't familiar with the green card system,
Right.
a green card allows someone to live and work permanently in the U.S., but it's not the same as citizenship.
Correct.
And this distinction is important because it can actually impact the legal rights of individuals in situations like this.
Yeah.
Now, Owens is claiming that Khalil has been held for 3 days without any charges being filed,
Wow.
and that the government's entire justification seems to hinge on his political views and activism.
Right. And that's where things get really murky.
Yeah.
We have statements from government officials like Caroline Leavitt
Uh-huh.
suggesting that Khalil was involved in activities that threaten national security
Yeah.
and U.S. foreign policy interests.
Mm-hmm.
They point to his alleged involvement with groups distributing pro-Hamas materials and disrupting campus events.
But Owens calls this rhetoric absent any fact.
Okay.
Leavitt even claims to have flyers with the Hamas logo on them,
Right.
but she doesn't actually show them in the footage.
Yeah.
It all feels a bit vague.
It does. It raises questions about the burden of proof,
Yeah.
especially when dealing with accusations as serious as terrorism. Senator Marco Rubio also weighed in,
Oh, really?
emphasizing that visas and green cards are privileges, not rights,
Yeah.
and can be revoked if someone's actions are deemed contrary to U.S. interests.
Right.
He even goes so far as to call Khalil complicit
Complicit.
in activities that disrupted learning institutions and potentially endangered Jewish students.
Complicit. That's a word we hear a lot these days.
Yeah.
But what does it actually mean in a legal context?
Right.
And is it enough to justify detention?
That's a great question.
Yeah.
It gets into some pretty complex legal territory.
Yeah.
Complicity generally implies some level of involvement or knowledge of wrongdoing,
Mm-hmm.
even if the person wasn't directly involved in the act itself.
Okay.
But the level of involvement required to establish complicity
Yeah.
and whether it's enough to warrant legal action can vary depending on the specific circumstances
Yeah.
and the laws in question.
It reminds me of how Owens draws a parallel to Ivanka Trump being labeled complicit in various scandals during her father's presidency. Despite not having direct involvement,
Right.
it makes you wonder at what point does simply being associated with something become a crime?
It's a slippery slope,
Yeah,
and one that's often debated in legal and ethical circles.
for sure.
There's a real danger in eroding the distinction between direct involvement and mere association,
Yeah.
particularly when it comes to issues as sensitive as national security.
And now hold on to your hats because this is where the story takes a really unexpected turn.
Oh.
Owens reveals that Khalil previously worked as a program manager
Okay.
for the British Embassy,
For the British?
of all places,
Wow.
focusing on police efforts in Syria.
Interesting.
There's even a statement from a British diplomat who vouches for Khalil's character.
Oh.
And it says he underwent a rigorous vetting process
Mhm.
and was cleared to work on sensitive issues for the British government.
That's a pretty significant detail.
Yeah.
If he was deemed trustworthy enough to work on peace efforts in Syria
Right.
for a close ally like the UK, it certainly raises questions about the validity of the accusations being leveled against him by the U.S. government.
Huge red flag.
It seems like there's a real discrepancy in how he's being perceived and treated.
So we have these conflicting narratives.
Yeah.
One painting Khalil as a potential threat, the other as a peace advocate vetted by a trusted ally.
Right.
And the U.S. government isn't exactly being transparent about the reasons for his detainment.
Exactly. And this lack of transparency further fuels the concerns being raised by Owens and others.
Yeah.
It's difficult to assess the legitimacy of the government's actions
Right.
when they're not providing clear evidence or specific charges.
Yeah.
It just leads to speculation and a sense of distrust.
And to complicate matters even further,
Right.
Owens points out that ICE BIE transferred Khalil from New York, where he was initially detained, all the way down to Louisiana.
Wow.
His lawyers claim this was a deliberate move to disrupt court proceedings and limit his access to his family and legal counsel.
This raises concerns about due process, which essentially means everyone has the right to a fair and impartial legal process, regardless of their citizenship status.
Right.
If legal maneuvering is being used to make it harder for someone to defend themselves,
Yeah.
that's a serious red flag.
It's beginning to feel like something else might be going on here.
Right.
Something beyond just a simple case of national security.
It does seem like there's more to this story than meets the eye.
For sure.
And to fully understand the implications of this case, we need to delve deeper into the arguments being made about free speech, the rights of immigrants,
Yeah.
and the potential for political motivations behind the government's actions.
Absolutely. This deep dive is just getting started.
Okay.
We'll be back in a moment to explore those deeper layers.
You know, this whole situation with Khalil, it really brings up some pretty fundamental questions about free speech,
Yeah.
especially for non-citizens living in the U.S.
Right.
Owens actually highlights this by bringing up a heated debate between Glenn Greenwald and Mike Cernovich,
Okay.
two commentators with very different viewpoints.
I vaguely remember that going viral.
Yeah,
One of those internet clashes that gets everybody all riled up.
for sure.
Remind me, what were their stances?
Well, Cernovich, who's known for his more provocative and often controversial takes,
Right.
basically argued that non-citizens shouldn't be engaging in U.S. political activities at all. He even went so far as to suggest that figures like Jordan Peterson, the Canadian psychologist who's often critical of U.S. policies,
Yeah.
should be deported for speaking out.
Whoa. Deporting someone for expressing their opinions.
Right.
That seems pretty extreme.
It is.
I can see how that kind of stance would create a chilling effect.
Yeah.
Making people afraid to speak their minds.
Right.
Especially if they're not citizens.
Exactly. And Greenwald, who's a journalist and First Amendment advocate, pushed back hard on that idea.
Good for him.
He argued that if that were the case, then wouldn't the Biden administration have been justified in deporting Peterson for criticizing their policies? Greenwald was pointing out the hypocrisy
Right.
of applying this standard selectively based on whether you agree with someone's views or not.
So it boils down to a question of whether criticizing U.S. leaders or policies should be grounds for deportation,
Exactly.
regardless of your citizenship status.
Right.
It's a pretty slippery slope, isn't it?
It is. And Owens uses this debate to highlight a broader concern that anyone, regardless of their citizenship,
Okay.
could potentially be targeted for expressing views that are deemed contrary to national interests.
Yeah.
But the problem is national interest can be a pretty subjective and malleable concept,
Yeah, for sure.
open to interpretation and manipulation.
That's a bit unsettling.
It is.
It suggests that just expressing an opinion, especially one critical of the government, could land you in hot water.
It's definitely a concern.
Yeah.
And Owens draws a parallel to her own experience during the COVID-19 pandemic.
Oh, really?
She claims she faced a lot of backlash for expressing skepticism towards certain policies, almost like she was being treated as a threat to national security, simply for questioning the official narrative.
That's a theme she keeps coming back to.
Yes.
This idea that the definitions of terrorism and national security can be broadened and even weaponized to silence dissenting voices.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And she believes Khalil's case is another example of this.
Okay.
She argues that he's being targeted not for any concrete actions, but for holding views that are deemed unacceptable.
It's important to note, though, that Owens makes it clear she's not defending any illegal activities.
Right.
Her point is that if Khalil actually broke the law,
Yeah,
then present the evidence and charge him accordingly.
right.
But without that evidence, it all feels very suspect.
She's drawing a distinction between legitimate law enforcement and what she sees as politically motivated persecution.
Right.
And it's a distinction that's crucial to maintain in a democratic society.
Owens also brings up a point that really tugs at the heartstrings.
Okay.
Khalil's wife is 8 months pregnant, meaning she's likely to give birth without him by her side.
That's awful.
It adds this whole other layer of human cost to the situation.
It does raise questions about the proportionality of the government's response.
Right.
Even if Khalil were eventually charged with a crime,
Yeah.
Was it really necessary to detain him under these circumstances, knowing the impact it would have on his family?
It's a stark reminder of how these situations aren't just abstract legal battles.
Yeah,
They involve real people and families who are deeply affected.
absolutely. And Owens argues that this heavy-handed approach doesn't actually make anyone safer.
Yeah.
If anything, it just fuels more division and distrust, undermining the very principles of justice and fairness the government claims to be upholding.
Speaking of public response, Owens then shifts gears to show us the protests that have erupted in response to Khalil's detainment.
Okay.
There are scenes of people rallying outside City Hall,
Mhm.
demanding his release and condemning the government's actions. It's clear that this case has struck a nerve.
It definitely seems to have tapped into anxieties about free speech and the rights of immigrants.
Yeah.
Owens includes a clip of Bahar Azmi,
Okay.
Khalil's lawyer and the legal director of the Center for Constitutional Rights, addressing the crowd.
Right.
Azmi's argument is that this detention isn't really about security.
Mm-hmm.
It's about repression, plain and simple.
Whoa.
He accuses the government of targeting Khalil for his activism in support of Palestinian human rights.
So he's framing this as a deliberate attempt to silence someone who's critical of U.S. foreign policy.
Yeah.
That's a pretty serious accusation.
It is, Azmi even goes so far as to draw parallels to historical periods of political repression in the U.S.,
Oh, wow.
like the Red Scare and McCarthyism,
Oh, jeez.
suggesting that Khalil's case is part of a larger pattern of silencing dissent under the guise of national security.
So he's essentially saying that the government is trying to make an example of Khalil
Right.
to deter others from speaking out. And he vows to fight tooth and nail for Khalil's release and to prevent this kind of repression from spreading.
It's a powerful statement that connects this very specific case to a broader struggle for civil liberties.
Yeah.
And it taps into the fears of many who worry that their own freedoms are slowly being chipped away.
This is where things get really interesting. Owens then plays a clip of a Jewish professor speaking at the rally.
A Jewish professor?
Yeah, and he actually argues that the government's actions are counterproductive to ensuring the safety of Jewish students on campus.
That's a really important perspective to consider.
It is.
It challenges the narrative that silencing pro-Palestinian voices somehow equates to protecting Jewish students.
Oh,
The professor's point is that this kind of repression actually creates more fear and division, not less.
and he also expresses concern about how easily individuals and groups are labeled anti-Semitic,
Right.
simply for expressing opinions critical of Israeli policies.
Mm-hmm.
He argues that this tactic is often used to shut down legitimate debate and stifle dissent.
That's something Owens has been vocal about as well.
She has.
She criticizes the overuse and weaponization of terms like anti-Semitism and terrorism,
Yeah.
arguing that they've lost their original meaning and are now used as blunt instruments to silence anyone who deviates from the accepted narrative.
She contends that this kind of tactic is actually dangerous because it prevents genuine dialogue and understanding.
Right.
Instead of addressing the root causes of conflict and injustice,
Yeah.
it just shuts down any attempt at having a nuanced conversation.
Right. And she advocates for a more fact-based approach,
Okay.
where evidence and logic take precedence over emotional appeals and inflammatory rhetoric.
She also criticizes what she sees as a double standard in how free speech is applied,
Go.
arguing that certain groups are given more leeway to express controversial views,
Mm-hmm.
while others are quickly silenced or labeled dangerous for expressing similar sentiments.
It's a critique we hear a lot.
We do.
This idea that those in power often selectively apply principles like free speech based on their own ideological biases.
To wrap up this section of the video, Owens reiterates her call for transparency and evidence in Khalil's case.
Okay.
She urges her audience to be skeptical of the government's narrative and to demand concrete proof of any wrongdoing before accepting labels like terrorist or complicit.
It's a reminder that we all have a responsibility to think critically,
Yes.
especially when we're being bombarded with information from all sides.
Right.
We need to question assumptions, evaluate evidence,
For sure.
and be wary of emotionally driven narratives regardless of where they're coming from.
It's so easy to get swept up in the heat of the moment.
It is.
But we can't let outrage or fear cloud our judgment.
Right.
We have to hold fast to principles like due process and freedom of speech, even when it's uncomfortable or challenging.
Absolutely. And that's why cases like Khalil's are so important.
I agree.
They force us to confront these fundamental questions about the balance between security and freedom,
Yeah.
the limits of acceptable dissent,
Mm-hmm.
and what justice really means in a diverse and often divided society.
Okay, we've covered a lot of ground here.
We have.
From the specifics of Khalil's case to broader concerns about free speech, immigration, and the potential for government overreach.
Yeah.
But Owens doesn't stop there.
Oh,
She ends her video with a really thought-provoking question.
okay.
Who ultimately benefits from this whole situation?
That's a question worth pondering.
Yeah,
It seems like everyone involved is losing something in this scenario.
right.
So who stands to gain, and what are the potential long-term consequences of this case? Not just for Khalil, but for all of us. Let's unpack that in the final part of our deep dive.
Yeah, it's a real head-scratcher who benefits from this whole Khalil thing.
It really is.
Because it seems like everybody involved is kind of, taking a hit.
Owens makes the point that this case doesn't make anyone safer.
Right.
Khalil's detained, his family's suffering, and the government's facing accusations of overreach and a lack of transparency.
Yeah.
It's hard to see any winners here.
And, if you think about it, this whole thing seems to be backfiring on the Trump administration and their supporters, too.
How so?
Well, Owens even says that they're being painted as hypocrites and anti-free speech,
Oh, wow.
which plays right into the hands of their critics.
That's a really insightful point.
Yeah.
It's interesting how this case has exposed these fault lines within the conservative movement itself.
Yeah.
You have some who are quick to defend the government's actions no matter what. And then you have others like Owens who are expressing serious concerns about the erosion of civil liberties,
Right.
even if it means going against their own political tribe.
She even suggests that this whole situation could end up pushing people away from the Trump administration.
Really?
Like, if this is how they treat even someone from their own base who's raising questions,
Right.
it doesn't exactly inspire confidence, does it?
It certainly raises questions about loyalty versus principle.
Yeah.
At what point do you stand up and say, hold on, this isn't right, even if it means challenging those you normally align with?
Yeah.
That's a tough position to be in, but it's essential for any healthy democracy.
Owens also points out that this whole case plays right into the hands of those who want to portray the Trump administration and their supporters as authoritarian or even fascistic. It just gives them more fuel for that narrative, which further demonizes conservative viewpoints and makes productive dialogue even harder.
It's like throwing gasoline on an already raging fire.
Exactly.
It's a reminder that we all need to be mindful of the broader context and how our actions might be perceived, even if our intentions are good.
Right.
Sometimes the optics of a situation can be just as important as the substance, especially in today's highly polarized climate.
And then Owens goes even deeper, arguing that the real beneficiaries of this whole mess are those who thrive on chaos and division. She says it's the same playbook we've seen over and over again.
Okay.
Create fear, stir up outrage, pit people against each other, and boom, everyone's so busy fighting that they don't notice the real issues that need to be addressed.
It's a cynical view, but you can't deny that there's a certain logic to it.
Yeah.
It makes you wonder who's setting the agenda, who's framing the narrative,
Right.
and who's profiting from all the division and distraction.
You know what really sticks with me from this whole deep dive?
What's that?
Is how crucial it is to demand evidence.
Yeah.
No matter who's making the claim or what side of the political spectrum they're on.
Absolutely.
It's so easy to get caught up in the emotions of a story,
It is.
but we have to step back and ask those tough questions.
Like what?
Like, where's the proof? What are the facts?
Absolutely. We can't let ourselves be swayed by rhetoric or appeals to emotion.
Right.
Critical thinking is more important now than ever.
Yeah.
We have to be discerning consumers of information.
Mm-hmm.
And that means checking our own biases, being willing to consider different perspectives, and always demanding evidence.
And I think this case also highlights the potential dangers of unchecked power.
Yeah.
Especially when it's wielded in the name of security or national interest. We have to be vigilant about protecting those fundamental rights and holding our leaders accountable no matter who they are or what party they represent.
That's a key takeaway. It's easy to get complacent when things seem to be going well,
Yeah.
but rights aren't something you can just take for granted.
Yeah.
They have to be actively defended and protected all the time by everyone.
Wow. Wow, what a journey this deep dive has been.
It has been.
We started with a single news story about a detained student,
Right.
and we ended up exploring everything from free speech and immigration to the very nature of truth and power.
It's amazing how a single case can open up so many different avenues of inquiry, isn't it?
It is.
It just shows how interconnected all these issues really are, and it underscores the importance of staying informed, engaged, and willing to grapple with complex questions.
Exactly. There are no easy answers here,
Nope.
but that's what makes these conversations so vital.
I agree.
So as you go about your day, keep those questions in mind. What are the limits of free speech? How do we balance security and individual rights? Who benefits from division and conflict? And how can we as individuals contribute to a more informed, just, and compassionate society?
Those are questions worth pondering, and they're questions we'll continue to explore here on The Deep Dive.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. We'll see you next time.